Good morning. If you'll open to John 15, that's where we'll be this morning, as we talk about Jesus, our true friend. In John 15, this is the night before Jesus' crucifixion, and he's spending time with his disciples, preparing them for what it's going to be like after he not only dies and resurrects, but ascends to heaven and essentially leaves them alone on the earth. And in John 15, he says in verses 12 through 17, "This is my commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends, if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all things that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you would go and bear fruit and that your fruit would remain, so that whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he may give to you. This I command you, that you love one another." It's easy to take these verses for granted because they're so familiar, but just think for a moment about some of the most powerful people in the world. Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Mark Cuban, Warren Buffett. Are any of they our friends? Are we friends with any of them? No way. We're way too unimportant for them. They have way too many important things to do, and if you think about it, there's probably not a whole lot of value that we could add to them as their friends. And yet Jesus, who is God, the creator of the universe, in the flesh, says, "You are my friends." It's mind-boggling to me that the most powerful being in existence would find some value in us being his friend. And this is yet another thing that makes Christianity so unique from all the pagan religions that came before, because the pagans had no concept that the gods would be their friends. The gods were just totally emotionally detached from people, and they were so fickle that most people didn't ever know whether the gods were pleased with them or not, and maybe the God's going to destroy me today. So they're sort of living in this state of paranoia. Yet Jesus says, I'm not just your Lord and your master. I am also your friend. And as we prepare to eat the Lord's Supper with our friend this morning, I want us to really explore what that means. What really makes a good friend? Well, there's four things: presence, vulnerability, loyalty, and sacrifice. Presence. When we're in need, good friends, they don't just settle for sending a text or a card. They show up in person, no matter how inconvenient, because face-to-face interaction is so much more connective. In fact, there's only two people in the entire Old Testament who are said to be the friend of God. That's Abraham and that's Moses. And if you remember from our Exodus class, it said that Moses' relationship with God was so close that it said the Lord used to speak to Moses face-to-face, just as a man speaks to his friend. And how does John's gospel start? In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And then he says in verse 14, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." Jesus came to be present with us in the flesh. And and we don't have to flip here because I'm just going to reference these very quickly, but when he appointed his disciples, in Mark 3:14 it says, "He appointed the 12 so that they would be with him and that he could send them out to preach." So part of Jesus' goal in selecting his disciples was so that they could be present with him as he was present with them. In John 3, in verse 22, it says, "Jesus and his disciples came into the land of Judea, and there he was spending time with them and baptizing." For 3 years of his ministry, just imagine how many miles Jesus and his disciples walked together. How many conversations they had. How many times they sat around a fire or sat around a table, eating together, maybe even cooking meals together, laughing together, crying together, sharing stories with each other about how the day went, praying together, singing hymns together, comforting and encouraging each other after discouraging hard days, of which there would have been many, sleeping out under the stars together, sharing their hopes and their dreams. And here in John 15, it's the night before Jesus' death, and despite the horrors of what is awaiting him the next day, he's still spending time with his disciples. I mean, he could have gone off by himself and said, I just need to be alone. I don't want to be around anybody. I just want to be by myself. But he's staying with the disciples as long as he possibly can. The God of the universe put on flesh to give us the gift of friendship, to give us the gift of his presence with us. Secondly, vulnerability. So where we started in verse 15, Jesus draws a distinction. He says, I don't call you slaves because the slave does not know what his master is doing. But I've called you friends because all that I've heard from my Father I have made known to you. Jesus says he's not just our boss, he's our friend. And he's talking more about the slave-master relationship. But even if you think about your own relationship with your employer, the employer-employee relationship, isn't it usually the case that your boss at work isn't going to open up to you emotionally? Your boss is probably not going to share his or her feelings with you or let you in on all of their plans and tell you exactly why they're doing what they're doing. We don't confide in our boss typically at work. We don't really share our deepest secrets with our boss, and our boss doesn't share secrets with us. But Jesus is saying, you're my friends because I have let you in on my plans. I've told you my secrets. I've opened my heart to you and shared all of my love and my affection. This whole section, actually, from John 13 to 17, is about Jesus sharing his plans with them, to send the Holy Spirit to comfort them when he's gone. He shared with them what it was going to be like when he left, that they're going to suffer because if the world hated the master, they're going to hate the slaves as well. He shares the key to having joy. And he says, the key to joy is abiding in me. He opens up his heart. He prays to God for them in John 14, right in front of them, so that they'll know that his deepest desire for them is for their unity, in their oneness. And even before this night, think about how many times Jesus shared mysteries about the kingdom. He shared secrets about the kingdom through his parables. And then he would bring his disciples away from the crowds and he would share more things with them in private. He'd give them a deeper understanding of what he was teaching them. And he would teach them lessons about trust. And he'd tell them about his plans to go to Jerusalem and be killed by the religious leaders. And he allowed them to see his emotions. He allowed his disciples to see him crying at the death of Lazarus and crying in the Garden of Gethsemane and probably many other occasions as the man of sorrows. As a friend, he let them in. He allowed himself to be intimately known by them. Thirdly, loyalty. Verse 16, he says, you did not choose me, but I chose you. This is the beauty, part of the beauty and power of friendship, is that friendship is something that must be chosen. You don't choose your siblings. You're just kind of stuck with them. You're just born with them, right? You don't always make that choice. But friendship is a choice. And Jesus says, I'm choosing to be loyal to these disciples even before they knew who he was. Jesus had already chosen loyalty to them. Proverbs 17:17 says, a friend loves at all times. Everything that Jesus did was in their best interest, because they were his friends. Think about some different ways that he was loyal to them. He was loyal to them when he told them the truth, even when it would be tempting to lie to spare their feelings. Proverbs 27:6 says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. So when Jesus rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, because you're setting your mind not on God's interest, but on man's, he was actually being a loyal friend to Peter. When he rebuked the disciples, when they were freaking out in the storm, thinking they were just going to die, he said, ye of little faith. And he was being a loyal friend to his disciples. When Peter started sinking in the water, he was walking on the water, and then he started looking at the situation instead of looking at Jesus, and he started sinking. Jesus says to him, you of little faith, why did you doubt? He's being a loyal friend there, because loyal friends, they don't just tell us what we want to hear all the time. Loyal friends don't just agree with all of our ideas. They tell us what we need to hear. They tell us when we're not thinking straight. They tell us when we're not living right. He was a loyal friend by sticking with his friends even in their worst moments. Like when Peter began to sink for lack of faith, or when the disciples couldn't cast out demons because they were trusting in their own power and not enough in God's power, or when they were confused about Jesus' teachings, or when the night of his death they all scattered like cowards. Charles Spurgeon said one of the greatest acts of friendship by Jesus was that when the world was mocking him from the cross and all the disciples had abandoned him, he stayed. He stayed on the cross. He stayed loyal even when no one else was loyal to him. One writer said, real friends are those who, when you have made a fool of yourself, don't feel that you've done a permanent job. Even when Jesus' friends acted like fools, Jesus never left them. He stuck with them. And I love John 13. Turn with me there, John 13 and verse 1, the start of this whole section. I think this just demonstrates loyalty so well. Verse 1, John 13, now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. That's loyalty. That's friendship. And then finally, sacrifice. Back where we started, John 15, in verse 13, he says, greater love has no one than this, that one laid down his life for his friends. Now, I used to be confused by this verse. And maybe you've thought the same thing, but I thought, isn't it a greater act of love to die for one's enemies? Well, how is it a greater act to die for your friends? Well, I think it depends how you look at it. One could argue that dying for your enemies is a greater act of love because it's completely separate from your feelings and your affections. It's an act of goodwill and obedience to God despite how you feel about the person that you're dying for. So one could argue, that is a pretty great display of love. But on the other hand, dying for one's friends comes from a richer, fuller sense of love because it's also coupled with your affections. If you had to die to save your best friend, it would still be scary, yes, but it wouldn't feel like a chore or a duty like it would for an enemy. It would feel more like a privilege, an honor, and even a joy because you love and care for them so much. And this is what is so remarkable about Jesus' love. Because yes, we're all his enemies because we've all sinned against him. Yet, Jesus foresaw a time, even before his death on the cross, Jesus foresaw a time in the future when some of his enemies would become his friends. Which means for all of those who would be his future friends, he died on the cross not just out of a sense of duty, but even out of affection for us. He does draw a distinction in this text between his friends and his enemies in verse 14. His friends share common interests with him. They want the same things he wants, which is why they keep his commandments and why he considered his disciples his friends. See, sometimes we read this and Jesus is saying, you're only my friends if you keep my commandments. If you keep my commandments, then I'll be your friend. That's not what he's saying. He's saying those who are my friends keep my commandments because they have the same interests. We have the same goals and the same desires. It's why he considered his disciples to be his friends. Whereas, the Pharisees and so many others were his enemies because they had no common interest with him like his disciples did. And so here's what this means as Christians. And I think this is the most shocking thing ever. And I have a hard time believing it. And we'll see if I'm not the only one. This means, as Christians, that Jesus doesn't just love us. He likes us. Sometimes we get the impression that Jesus loved us by dying for us, yes, but that was purely out of a sense of duty to his Father, and he doesn't. There's not much affection for us, and he just kind of tolerates us, but he doesn't really want to be around us, right? But he did what he had to do. He had to love, and he had to die for us to save the sins of the world, but he doesn't really love it. That's not friendship at all. And sometimes, sadly, we treat Jesus that way too. We do all these acts of love for him out of duty, but we don't really like him, and we don't really want to talk to him. The cross should shatter all of that and should show us that Jesus is our true friend and that we need to be his true friends. As his friends, as Christians, as his disciples, his presence is still with us all day, every day. When we read his word, he's still being vulnerable to us. He's still opening up to us and sharing his secrets, sharing his plans and his heart with us as we read his word. He's still being loyal to us, telling us what we need to hear in his word. Not just what we want to hear, but what we need to hear in his word when we're not thinking straight, when we're not living right. Through his word, but also through other faithful friends in our lives. And even when we make complete fools of ourselves and we sin against him, he stays. And every Sunday, we come together to remember the greater love that Jesus had for us, his friends. Not just action, but affection. Not just duty, but delight. Not just love, but like. Let's enjoy this amazing meal with our true friend, Jesus.